On today's World Insight, China's global commitments for common good unveiled at the UN General Assembly in the words of Chinese President Xi Jinping.
中国将努力全年对外提供20亿剂疫苗。
What does China's Global Development Initiative mean for a world in turbulence and transformation? And the delivery of crucial aid to millions of struggling Afghans, a hot button at the United Nations. For a clearer picture of the humanitarian situation, we'll hear from the International Red Cross president.
Afghanistan is in a very specific situation because it doesn't have a broadly recognized government and international institutions coming to help the country.
Hello, I'm Tian Wei, and this is World Insight coming to you live from Beijing. We begin today's program at the United Nations, where the 76th General Assembly session opened with a mix of in-person and virtual speeches. Several world leaders, including Chinese President Xi Jinping, addressed the assembly. President Xi from China called for bolster confidence and working together in dealing with global threats and challenges to build a better world for all. He presented 6 commitments under the Global Development Initiative, which includes prioritizing development, taking a people-centered approach, benefits for all, innovation-driven development, harmony between man and nature, and results-oriented actions. President Xi Jinping from China called on countries to band together toward balanced and inclusive growth.
Profound changes are taking place in human society. The world has entered a period of new turbulence and transformation. It falls on each and every responsible statesman to answer the questions of our times and make a historical choice with confidence, courage, and a sense of mission.
Not only the Chinese leaders, the UN Secretary General and many other world leaders did deliver their speeches as well at the UNGA opening. Joe Biden, the President of the United States, made his first address as U.S. President to the Assembly. He made repeated references to the importance of multilateralism, stressing the need for nations to work together for a shared future. He referenced the disagreements between China and the U.S. while insisting he doesn't want conflict. He made his case before the UN gathering following big blows to the U.S. image, many believe, on international cooperation, including the chaotic withdrawal of troops from Afghanistan. He made no specific response to the criticism, though, this time. The ongoing UNGA 2021 is expected to discuss the fight against COVID-19, inequality, justice, and climate change. So, could global leaders reach a consensus on these critical issues? Let's ask our panelists. Now, for more on the United Nations General Assembly that is going on in New York, in Islamabad, Mosharraf Zaidi, senior fellow of Tabat Lab, that's an Islamabad-based think tank. In Boston, Jim Walsh, senior research associate at MIT's Security Studies program. In Brussels, Nicholas White, senior director and head of services to government at APCO's Brussels office. Last but not least, in Shanghai, Shending Li, professor from the Institute of International Studies with Fudan University. Gentlemen, what a pleasure to see all of you on this very important day. Usually, when the UN General Assembly opens, crucial debates happen. Every leader representing their country want to make a mark there. Certainly we see many try to do the same thing this year. Now, how should we see the Secretary General's call at the very beginning of the session, saying we better work together to restore hope and confidence, trust? Mr. White.
I think this needs to be seen very, very clearly in the context of the crisis around climate change. You know, we're at the stage where it's going to be very difficult to save the world from a warming of more than 2.5 degrees above the baseline. The UN General Assembly is not where this is going to be decided. That will be in Edinburgh in a few weeks' time. But it is the moment when people are going to make their commitments. And we've seen very significant commitments made in the last couple of days, both by China, as you mentioned, and also by the United States. And I think the European Union, sitting here in Brussels, is also very much committed to going down that way. Will it be enough? We do not know. Certainly some of the small island states that are most concerned, most likely to be affected, feel that it isn't enough, and they have been complaining. So we will see, but I think this more than anything is what the Secretary General is referring to.
On climate change issue, of course, different countries paying their pledges this time at the UN General Assembly, China no exception. After pledging to peak carbon dioxide emissions by the year 2030 and achieve a carbon neutrality by 2060 as the largest developing country, China has taken another big step on climate change. Chinese President Xi Jinping announced at the UN General Assembly that China will step up support for green and low carbon energy in other developing countries, and also will no longer build new coal-fired power projects beyond China's border. So that is a very clear commitment from China. Earlier, Professor Shen, there were concerns about that, but now that's already very clear. China will not build more new coal-fired power projects abroad. Professor Shen.
This is an issue that Mr. John Kerry talked to China in Tianjin. And the response from Foreign Minister, State Councilor Wang Yi was ambiguous. Wang Yi stated that when the U.S. is beating China on almost every issue, it's unrealistic that the U.S. would expect China to return in some area for bilateral cooperation. At that time, I thought Wang Yi is wrong. And today, President Xi Jinping made it clear that we would work with the U.S. with the formula that the U.S. proposed. Cooperation wherever possible, even though China and U.S. have difficulty in Hong Kong, in Xinjiang, South China Sea, Taiwan, human rights, but China and U.S. would cooperate and China respond to the world, not only to the U.S., that we would not build any more coal-burning power plants outside of China. This is a direct response to the U.S. in a very positive tone, and we will be waiting for the U.S. for any possible positive response to the U.S. To the Chinese side.
Well, since Mr. Walsh, you're the only American sitting in the panel, I have to go to you about an answer about that. Mr. Walsh, I know it doesn't represent the Biden administration, but go ahead, speak your mind.
Well, I agree with my colleagues that the climate piece of this is very important, but I'd like to step back a little bit for both Xi's and Biden's speech. There's been a lot of talk around the world about rising tensions between China and the U.S.
Let me just let you to comment on this point first, because it seems that a lot of people agree this is about climate change. The Secretary General has been calling on world leaders. So let me just talk about that point a bit with you before we move on to the other general aspects. So, Mr. Walsh.
Sure. Yes, and so I think under a Biden administration, and my colleague mentioned Senator Kerry, that this is a positive development. Both, I would say at the UN, if you look at what China and the US did in their speeches, this was all very positive. No one really took a swing at one another, and they've all made pledges to push on climate. And so I think that's a serious, constructive approach on both parties' part. But I would pull back just for 10 seconds and say that climate is one example of where there has to be cooperation between China and the U.S., or between China, Russia, and the U.S., between big, important countries and collections of countries like Europe. Now, we could have had a situation where they came to the UN and started throwing punches, verbal punches at one another. That did not happen. Instead, they are emphasizing, yes, we have differences, but we can only solve big global problems, whether it's climate, proliferation, what have you,
All right.
if the parties hold on to a relationship that allows them to cooperate. That's very positive development. in my view.
Words, at least, are coordinating, apparently, with one another.
Exactly.
Even though they have different phrases to describe it, and the priority might be different, and the ways to get there could be different, but still, there are some common ground. But Mr. Zaidi, is that also your take?
You know, I hate to go against the grain way, but you know, the experience of Pakistan as you know, one country, but not an insignificant one in any of the key issues, particularly climate. Pakistan is one of the top 5 climate-affected nations on the planet. I think that the insistence of, for example, President Xi Jinping on using multilateral problems is almost the opposite of what I think a lot of the behavioral instincts of the Biden administration so far seem to be, whether it's behavior with strong allies in NATO like France, or it's with frenemies like Pakistan, non-NATO allies, but also easy scapegoats for things, or it's with strategic competitors like China. I don't think that climate will be able to be isolated as an island of cooperation when the principal instinct of the Biden administration is to frame every single issue on the through the prism of its strategic competition with China. So I'm glad that there hasn't been any kind of verbal fisticuffs at the UN so far, and it seems like there's cooperation on climate.
Okay.
But I would not bank on that being consistently the case, because eventually, if the principal lens is strategic competition, then even on climate, the U.S. will find some way to beat China over the head, and I'm sure China will find some way to rhetorically push back when it feels that that's taking place.
So I really wonder, gentlemen, when you are giving the answers, it seems that we have a whole horizon of different answers, from quite pessimistic to the best, cautiously optimistic, if I could use that word for now. But let me move on to other issues, because it's not just climate change, it's also issues like hotspot Afghanistan. Now, things are a little bit complicated with the U.S. situation, and the world has been very concerned about the way U.S. left Afghanistan after 20 years occupation. And now the interim government of the Taliban try to work with the international community, but still a lot of uncertainty. Now, Mr. Walsh, what do you think will be the best word to use, legacy, the worst words to use, lessons, for the United States after that 20 years? How is that issue likely to be touched upon in the future days of the UN General Assembly?
You know, I don't think the U.S. is going to put a big focus on Afghanistan. I mean, it is human and governmental tendency, once you are done with something, not to go back to it, to leave it and move on elsewhere. And you'll see in the U.S. press, there's coverage of Afghanistan, but it's declining each day. Now, the U.S. has an important role to play. It has all this money in U.S. banks that's frozen. It's a world leader. It's part of the negotiation. As reported today, U.S. military leaders talk with Taliban political leaders every day to coordinate all the little things that have to be done to sort of bring this transition process to a close. But you know, I don't think the U.S. is going to make this a big focus. And I think if you look at the real, and it's a problem, Wei, you and I have talked about this, and it's not going to be resolved satisfactorily. The Taliban wants recognition, and it wants its money back. And the international community, not the U.S., but including the U.S., the international community, including Imran Khan, who spoke to this recently, want the Taliban to do things first before being recognized. I think we have a bit of a standoff. No side is going to be happy. Eventually, some of that money is going to be released to Afghanistan. It has to, because of the humanitarian crisis. But people are going to be reluctant to give the Taliban a whole boatload of money, and then and fear that the Taliban will take that money and then do what they want.
All right.
So we're in for a period of negotiation in which no parties are happy.
Well, there are international crisis reverse groups and also humanitarian groups that are calling on international institutions in which the U.S. has a big say to unfreeze the assets of Afghanistan because there's a humanitarian crisis going on right now. Too late will even mean bigger crisis. Having said that, though, I have to call upon the Pakistan voice. Are we still having you, Mr. Zaidi? About the latest development. We understand special envoys from China, Pakistan, Russia just met with various officials with the Taliban interim quote-unquote government. And they have been discussing about humanitarian aid, about bringing more different factions of Afghanistan into the quote-unquote interim government and the future governance. How do you see, Mr. Zaidi, in this sense, the international community could play, and from now on, when the U.S., as Mr. Jim Walsh just said, just clean the hands and say, we're out of this. What are going to be the roles of the other and the UN's role at the General Assembly?
Well, I think this is really one of the most foundational moments that is bringing to fore clarity about the increasing corrosion of the multilateralism and the capacity of countries to work together at the UN. I think what's at stake right now, and has been for many years, I think ever since September 11th, there's been a constant corrosion, but I think in the last few years, as populist movements in the West have taken over and prompted behaviors by Western governments like the United Kingdom and particularly like the US to behave in a more isolationist and self-interested way, that has come because these countries were so vital at the United Nations with the P5 structure at the UNSC. I think what's happened is it's really shaken up the capacity and capability of multilateralism as an idea. So the fact that you see the neighboring countries of Afghanistan trying to resolve this, you see China, Russia, and Pakistan sending their special envoys, actually at a time when the UNGA has been convened and is meeting, why does it require Pakistan, Russia, and China to send their special envoys? And I think the answer is that the multilateralism that President Xi is asking for and appealing for is actually, it has already collapsed. And so I think one of the questions that the UN and especially the US and the other Western powers need to examine is how much longer they think that the UN can sustain as a credible set of institutions in the face of these behaviors which are more unilateral and interest related.
All right, we only have 1.5 minutes to go. It's not fair for the other two speakers, but I have to ask in a very concise way that we heard about multilateralism a lot in the speeches of many, but we also heard so-called partnerships and allies with a huge emphasis on that rather than multilateralism. How should we see the differences in words and also the differences certainly already in deeds? Mr. White, if you have 40 seconds, what would you say?
I think we should be careful that we're not using different words to refer to the same thing. I think with multilateralism, I agree that there's been a lack of coordination, there's been a lack of ambition. I think also a lack of strategy. If I go back to Afghanistan, we want to have a situation where there's a recognized government of Afghanistan that everybody can deal with. Okay. We need to think about how we get there and who we do it with.
Mr. Shen, sorry, you have the only 30 seconds to 35. Go ahead, sir.
Well, we can take all possible means, China-Afghan bilateralism, China-US bilateral consultation system, neighboring country, small multilateralism, and maybe a UN-based true multilateralism. We cannot exclude any lateralism.
Well, those are great points. I want to thank the four of you, gentlemen, for joining us on this very special day. The beginning of the UN General Assembly and all those speeches given by the political leaders, will they be the one that would answer the questions of century? And with confidence and resolve, we'll see the rest of the week. Thank you so much for joining us. Really appreciate it. You're watching World Insight with me, Tian Wei. Coming up in our live program,